Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome to KJZZ's Book Club night. We are so delighted to have all of you come. This was a record amount for us this evening. We've got about 84 people that are going to join us. So thank you all for coming. I'll ask that you all remain on mute throughout the interview with Molly Ball, just so that no background sounds and etc. can interrupt. As a KJZZ member and a sustaining member, most of you know about our book club, but if you don't, I encourage you to become a member of the station and become part of the sustaining membership, and you will be invited to all our book club events. And so Molly is going to be interviewed tonight by Lauren Gilger, who is, she's our go-to for interviews. I was just telling Lauren, she gets elected to do these interviews because she does such an amazing job. And you've probably heard her as one of our producers on the show. Lauren does an amazing job there. And Lauren, how long have you been with us?
I think a little over 5 years now, going on 6.
So Lauren does a super job for us. She is personable, she's insightful, she's smart. And of the 3 producers for the show, she's the prettiest one. So we appreciate Lauren. We'll probably have the interview for about an hour, and then we'll have some time for questions. So on the Zoom, go ahead and feel free to chat.
We may not be attending this.
Go ahead and chat a question on the side, and then at the end, we'll have a time of question and answers with Molly. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Lauren take over. And Lauren, go ahead. Thank you.
Well, hello. Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Linda. I wish we could do this all in person, but this way we get to talk to so many people. So Molly's joining us from her home in DC, I think, in the Washington, DC area. This is Molly Ball. She is the author of Pelosi, the book we're going to talk about tonight. Everybody doesn't have their copy. There it is. A New York Times bestseller. She is Time Magazine's national political correspondent. You've probably heard her on NPR or seen her on television
several times.
Talking
so
in that role.
They're muting because they don't want to hear any noises here from us.
There we go. She is an award-winning reporter, a graduate of Yale University. And as I was reading her bio, I had to add this in because what a tidbit. She also happens to have won Who Wants to Be a Millionaire back in 2007, which is awesome. Congratulations to Molly. So thank you so much for being here. Sort of unrelated, but interesting. So there you go. Well, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. And we'll spend the next, 50 minutes, hour or so kind of picking your brain about this book and what you got, what drew you to it. And that's actually where I want to start is, like as a political reporter, someone who's worked in the DC world, for some time, I'm sure you had encountered Nancy Pelosi before you decided to write a large biography on her. What drew you to her? Why Nancy Pelosi?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you, Linda. Thanks everyone for being here. It's wonderful to be with my friends out west. As a Westerner myself, I'm originally from Denver and Idaho, and spent a long time in Las Vegas. So the story of how I got interested in Nancy Pelosi and how the book came to be is that in late 2017, I left my job at The Atlantic, where I'd been a reporter for Time Magazine. And one of my first assignments was to do a cover profile of Nancy Pelosi, who at that time, this is late 2017, early 2018, she had never been on the cover of Time Magazine, despite being the first woman Speaker of the House in history. 10 years prior, that she gained that title in 2007. And in fact, she'd never been on the cover of any American news magazine, including Time, Newsweek, US News. And occasionally in other interviews, she had expressed a little bit of bitterness about this. She'd say, isn't it curious that they've put all these men on the cover? They've put Boehner on the cover, they've put McConnell on the cover, but they've never put the first woman Speaker of the House on the cover. Well, we wanted to put her on the cover, not to, rectify some historical injustice, but because in 2018, if you remember, she was in the center of the news. She was the minority leader at that time of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. And we were going into the 2018 midterm elections, the first national elections of the Trump era, where what was at stake was really control of the House of Representatives, and therefore whether Nancy Pelosi would get to be Speaker for a second time. We all know how that turned out now, but if you think back to 2018, this is at a time when, Democrats had not expected to lose the 2016 election. They had failed to win back the House over and over every 2 years since 2010, when Nancy Pelosi lost the speakership the first time. And they were increasingly discouraged. Meanwhile, Republicans had signaled that Nancy Pelosi basically constituted their entire campaign strategy for the midterms, right? They were going to put her in every ad, hundreds of thousands of ads, tens of millions of dollars worth of ads. This was the tried and true Republican House electoral strategy that they had honed over years and years. And for the Democrats too, she was in the middle of their strategy, right? She was the source of a lot of the fundraising, campaign strategy, but she was also the source of a lot of angst. She was viewed as sort of a political liability because of those tens of millions of dollars in Republican campaign ads, tying, every moderate Democrat in a swing district all over the country to this unpopular, polarizing San Francisco liberal, the terrifying Nancy Pelosi. The short answer to your question is that I got an assignment, right? I was assigned to do this story. But I've reflected on it a lot because at the time, I don't know if she was a subject I would have chosen. She wasn't someone that I necessarily found all that interesting, to be totally honest. As a political writer, the characters you like to write about are the big personalities, the Sarah Palins and Lindsey Grahams and Stacey Abrams of the world, right? The soaring oratory, the hilarious quips, the big characters. And she's sort of the opposite of that, right? She's very disciplined. She's kind of private. She's not a great public speaker. You don't catch her sort of telling her story in spontaneous terms at the drop of a hat. So it took me a while to sort of appreciate what made her interesting. But so I met her for the first time for the purposes of this profile at a little bakery in Little Italy in Baltimore, where she grew up. And she had chocolate ice cream for breakfast, even though it was January in Baltimore and about 20 degrees out. So that struck me as meaningful and interesting. This is someone who clearly is going to have what she wants, no matter what anybody thinks. But we talked about her life and her roots, and I'll probably talk more about that as we get going. But what struck me at that time was that starting the day after Donald Trump was elected, the most important political trend in America, basically, was this historic political uprising of American women. It was the Women's March. It was record-breaking numbers of women, not just voting and organizing, but running for office and seeking political power in a way that literally had never before happened in American history. So it struck me as sort of ironic that here you had the most powerful woman in American political history, Nancy Pelosi, and all anyone wanted to talk about when it came to her was, well, why won't she go away? Why is she such a liability for the Democrats? Why is she, such a boogeyman for the Republicans? And why won't she just, get rid of this problem by moving on? And so I thought that was sort of an interesting irony, that here's someone who is known to be good at the job of actually running the House of Representatives, passing legislation, and yet all anybody ever talks about with her is how much people seem to dislike her. So that was sort of what my profile was about. It ran on the cover of Time magazine in September 2018. But by that point, I just felt like there was a bigger story to tell. She's one of these people who I think everyone has an opinion about, but very few people actually know her story. And then then just to sort of close the loop, once the Democrats did win the midterms in 2018, there was this hilarious sort of 180-degree reversal, right, where a lot of the same people who'd been disparaging Nancy Pelosi and talking about what a liability she was, suddenly turned around and went, oh, well, maybe we should keep her around. Maybe she is actually good at her job. Maybe she can actually do this job of running the House of Representatives. And particularly after the moment that appears on the cover of the book, the meeting with Trump in the Oval Office in December 2018. So I thought that, so it seemed to me that there was now an appetite for people to know more about this public figure who I'd argue had been sort of unjustly maligned and underappreciated for much of her career.
Yeah, that's definitely a theme in the book. And I think the theme we'll hear as I continue to ask you questions and you answer them through the next hour or so is that, right? Like that she is a process person, right? Like she's a how the sausage gets made person. She's very organized, she's very disciplined, she's not the big personality. That kind of stuff is really interesting. So let's start then with a little bit about her family, as you referenced there, Baltimore, growing up there. She's from this kind of political like legendary family in that town, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so she does come from a political family. At the time that Nancy Pelosi was born in 1940, her father was a member of Congress, a Democratic member of Congress who supported FDR and the New Deal. And when she was 7, he successfully ran for mayor of Baltimore, became the first Italian-American mayor of Baltimore, and went on to serve 3 terms. So there's a wonderful picture that's in the book of 7-year-old Nancy D'Alessandro holding the Bible and swearing in her father as he becomes mayor for the first time. So she clearly, was surrounded by politics her whole life, and her father was a sort of classic early 20th century democratic or urban democratic ethnic machine politician. Every sort of stereotype you can think of sort of urban ethnic machine politicians from that time. They lived in Little Italy. They never left. There was a very sort of intensely segregated city, not just by race, but by ethnicity. And all of the sort of different tribes of the city voted in blocks and had bosses and this sort of thing. So I think you can see a lot of, Nancy Pelosi's skill in that sort of transactional politics, counting votes, knowing every precinct, every block of the city as her father did. But that in that first conversation that I had with Nancy Pelosi in Baltimore, she went out of her way to talk not just about her father, but about her mother. And it was clear to me from that first conversation that she felt like her mother's contributions to her life and background and upbringing and character had been overlooked because her father had the famous name. Her father was obvious. She obviously went into the family business that her father was in. And I think she felt that not enough people understood that it wasn't simply her father running that political operation. Her mother was the sort of classic, behind every good man type of political wife. And this is very common in political families, right? That the name on the ballot is just sort of the front person for this big operation. And that was certainly the case in the D'Alessandro family. It was her mother who, Nancy Pelosi had 5 older brothers, and they always said that their mother, Big Nancy, as she was called, was the real politician in the family. She was the strategist. She was the enforcer. She ran the Baltimore Democratic Women's Club out of the basement of their row house. And that was, and she was sort of responsible for getting out the vote when election time came. She ran the favor file out of their parlor. This was anybody who needed anything from the mayor's office, from the government, could literally come to his house and ask for a favor, whether it was getting on welfare, getting into the city hospital, getting a job, what have you. And so, the mayor and his family would see to it that the favor was done, and then the chit would go in the file. And when election time came around, it was time to repay the favor to the mayor. So in fact, Nancy Pelosi, young Nancy D'Alessandro, was also responsible for helping administer the favor file from the time she was about 11. Her mother was a big personality. She was legendarily tough. She supposedly once punched a precinct worker in the face who had displeased her. She told off several presidents to their faces, including LBJ and Ronald Reagan. And so she was a woman who stood her ground and took no guff. And I think you can see a lot of those characteristics in the Nancy Pelosi that we know today. But the other thing that I thought was very striking that Nancy Pelosi wanted me to know about her mother was how much her mother was held back by being a woman. That as a woman in the 1930s and 40s, there were a lot of things that she wanted to do and could not. She wanted to go to law school. She wanted to become an auctioneer. She actually patented a beauty product and wanted to sell it nationwide. She wanted to make investments, but in those days, to do any of those things, you needed a man's signature. You needed a man's position, support. And her husband didn't want her doing those things, so she couldn't do them. And so I think, the fact that Nancy Pelosi wanted me to know about these things, even though they didn't reflect particularly well on her own father, told me that it had really shaped her growing up to see her mother be stymied in this way. It had really shaped her growing up to see the ways that her mother's life was limited simply by the fact of her being a woman. And I think that really helped create the Nancy Pelosi's determination never to let anyone tell her what she couldn't do, and therefore to become not only the first woman to lead either party in the House of Representatives, but the first woman speaker.
So let's talk about her sort of evolution into politician herself, because she starts, in this family, grows up in the family, but then does kind of what you're describing her mother doing. She fundraises for the Democratic Party from her house, essentially, and becomes very good at that, it sounds like. How does she become the politician herself?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't realize this, but Nancy Pelosi did not actually run for office until she was 47 years old, and her 5 children were all basically out of the house. So she never did really balance career and family. She did the family, and then she did the political career. And in fact, she never envisioned herself running for office. I was pretty skeptical of this, right? Politicians always claim, oh, I never wanted to be the one on the ballot, but I just got pulled into it because people told me the country needed saving or whatever. But in her case, there's actually a lot of evidence and a lot of instances of her seeking to be the one behind the scenes, the strategist, the person pulling the strings, but not so much the person on the ballot herself. She married her college sweetheart. They moved to New York for his career in finance, and she had 5 children in the space of 6 years. They moved to San Francisco, where her husband, Paul Pelosi, who also comes from a political family of Democratic Italian Americans, where her husband's from. So they moved to San Francisco, where their 5th child was born. And she was a very busy and very she was a housewife who ran a very tight ship, and she was always involved in politics, right? She'd grown up with this attachment to the Democratic Party, and was particularly in love with John F. Kennedy and his style of politics. I think for her, as for a lot of American Catholics, it was tremendously gratifying to see him become president, and devastating when he was killed. But she always saw herself as a volunteer. She was active in all sorts of causes. She was active in the party. Even when she was in New York having babies, she would push the stroller around their neighborhood in Midtown, slipping Democratic leaflets for the midterms under people's apartment doors. So she was always, she wasn't the one out at the protest burning the draft cards. She was always in that sort of establishment lane of advocacy. And once they moved to California, she became even more involved. She was involved in the party. She helped Jerry Brown unexpectedly win the Maryland Democratic presidential primary in 1976. She started, as you said, raising money for Democratic candidates, first in California and then nationally. She chaired the California Democratic Party and helped bring the Democratic Convention to San Francisco in 1984, which coincidentally is where the idea of the San Francisco Democrat was first coined and gained currency. So she's kind of responsible for that too. And she even ran for chair of the Democratic National Committee and was not successful. So throughout all of this, she's resisting entreaties to run for office. People are telling her, you could run for mayor of San Francisco. You've got all these contacts. You know tens of thousands of volunteers that you recruited for the convention. You could run for governor of California. And she always turned them down. But after one of her political mentors, Phil Burton, who was a liberal congressman who was sort of legendary for his ability to get things done in Washington, he died, and his wife, Sala Burton, took his seat in Congress representing most of urban San Francisco. And then Sala Burton was stricken with cancer and called her friend, Nancy Pelosi, to her bedside. It's the sort of dramatic deathbed scene that I would not have believed if I hadn't spoken to several witnesses, because it sounds like something out of a movie.
It does.
But literally, her friend called her to her deathbed and said, "I want you to run for my seat in Congress. I want you to have it." And she finally said yes and agreed to do it, entered this very fractious field in a special election in 1987. 14 candidates, including many Democrats, many very well qualified Democrats. She'd never run for or held political office before. But that was basically her first and only ever tough election. And she went on to hold that seat until today. But the other thing I think is important to understand about that is that at that time, most women who got to Congress got there because their husbands had died. Yeah. Most women in Congress were there because they were connected to a man who had that seat. And at the time that she got to the House of Representatives in 1987, she was one of only 23 women out of 435 members of Congress. Again, most of whom were the widows of congressmen. So it was really a feat in those days and even her father was impressed that she'd gotten elected on her own name. Here she was 3,000 miles from Baltimore, where she would have been, as a D'Alessandro, she would have been considered political royalty. But in San Francisco, that name wouldn't have meant anything, and she won on her own terms.
It's really interesting. What do you like in your interviews with her and speaking with her and writing about her, researching about her? Do you think that like she thinks of herself as a crusader in that sense, like as the first woman to do a lot of these things and do it on her own terms?
Yes, I think that's very important to her, and representation for women means a lot to her. She talks about it a lot. She's done a lot to recruit women to run for Congress. She was tremendously proud of the fact that when she picked up that gavel again in 2019, when she became Speaker for the second time after the 2018 midterms, that was the centennial of women's suffrage, and it was also the year that for the first time in history, there were 100 women in the House of Representatives. So you may remember that visual when all the Democratic women, 80, 90 or so, wore white to the swearing in when she officially got that gavel for the second time. But it was tremendously gratifying for her that her second elevation to the speakership coincided with that anniversary and coincided with that landmark for women in the House. So, she's told me, she told others that part of the reason she stayed on after 2016 was that when Hillary Clinton lost the presidency, she realized that without her, there wouldn't be a woman in the room when there were negotiations happening between the House and Senate and White House, and that's something that's important to her. She tells this story about, in 2005, she had just become the leader of the Democratic minority, and she was summoned to the White House with the other leaders of the House and Senate. So the leaders of the majority minority in the House and Senate, and the president and vice president in the White House. And she looks around, this is during the George W. Bush presidency, and she looks around and she realizes not only is she the only woman in that room, but in 200 odd years of American history, she's the only woman who's ever been in that room. That for centuries, these men have been getting together to decide the policy for the nation And she's the first and only woman who's ever been in that room. And so she talks about sort of feeling the weight of the suffragists and everybody else on her shoulders. It's a little cheesy, but it's clearly something that she's very conscious of, that she is still blazing a trail. She is to this day still the only woman to lead a party in the Congress.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I want to ask you like a process question, because I always think this is really interesting, especially for a biography of someone who's alive, right? So like clearly you researched this meticulously, you interviewed her a lot of times, but she's notoriously, as you mentioned, I think private. Like we don't know a lot about her normally. How open was she with you? What was that process like, trying to read past her sort of steely exterior?
So, I do say in the book that I felt like I never quite got to the bottom of what makes her tick, because she is so private, and there are parts of her personal life that are simply off limits. I tried multiple times to get invited to her house, for example, and it became clear that she just was not going to let me or anybody else into that. But at the same time, when you write profiles, you're always trying to get at, who is the real person behind the facade or the act, or whoever this person is when the cameras are on. And so I've spoken to many of her personal friends from childhood, people who've known her for decades and decades, people who know her outside of politics. And they all said, there really is not another Nancy Pelosi who sort of comes to life when she knows there aren't, reporters or cameras present. She really is the same person. And I think, the sort of, it really is just her personality. She is a very private and sort of formal person. I think it's partly generational and cultural, comes from her background as a sort of good Catholic schoolgirl and as someone who was political royalty literally from the time that she was born. So she is someone whose defenses are sort of permanently up. But at the same time, with anyone that you're going to write about, it's just a process of trying to talk to as many people as possible, including the subject. And she was very generous with her time. I had several interviews with her, and I felt like I had finally gotten to a comfort level with her when she snapped at me, because she's not for being particularly patient when it comes to people she feels are wasting her time. And I suppose I was, taking too long to ask a question, or it was a particularly busy day. I think it was in the middle of impeachment. And she just sort of said, "What are we doing here?" And that was the first time that I felt like, oh, she is really sort of being herself with me.
That's probably a good thing in an odd way. You're like, oh, good, I got there. Well, I mean, I wonder, what did she think about you writing this biography? Was she happy about it? Was she flattered? Was she sort of like, I don't really care? I don't know. I'm just curious, given her public persona.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things I write about a lot in the book is her sort of lack of regard for public perception.
Yeah.
When it comes to her, right? And it's very clear to me that if she didn't have this particular quality, she could not have gotten where she is, simply because of the amount of abuse that is routinely hurled in her direction, the insults and so on. None of it's unfair necessarily. Politics ain't beanbag, right? And one of the things that she likes to say is it's politics. You've got to know how to throw a punch and take a punch. Mm-hmm. But that toughness and that ability to ignore people's insults, people's negative opinions of her, has been very important to her being able to get where she is. So all that is to say, I have asked her many times, and many people have asked her to sort of reflect on the way that she's perceived, to reflect on the degree to which she's viewed as a polarizing figure, and the degree to which she's been demonized and made the subject of so many of these ad campaigns far outside her own district. And she just really isn't interested. She has a line, she has a sort of canned response. She says, well, if I weren't effective, I wouldn't be a target. And then she wants to move on. She wants to talk about something else. She just really is not interested. And even going back to that first time that she ran for Congress, her friends would come to her and say, oh my gosh, they are saying the most horrible things about you. And she would cut them off. She'd say, well, I don't want to hear that. Why would I want to know that? Why would I want to know the horrible things they're saying about me? If you don't like what they're saying about me, go out and raise more money, go out and recruit more voters, go out and walk more precincts, because that, and so, you know, from that very first time that she ran for office, the word that her, that Soliburton and others used for her was operational. And I use it in the book, and I say it's sort of the skeleton key to her personality, that what she cares about is results, and almost everything else is irrelevant. So when I came to her staff and said I wanted to do this book, it took them a little convincing, from what I understand. They were on board. You know, everyone who works for a politician likes the idea of that person being important enough to have a book written about them. But it took a little bit of convincing for her, because her calculus is, how does this advance my goals? And her goals are not, how do I ensure that Nancy Pelosi is remembered 100 years from now as someone who was important or good or whatever. But her goals are, how do I, you know, win elections for Democrats and get important legislation passed to the House of Representatives. And so if she can't see sort of how any particular action is related to that goal, she's not all that interested in it. So she did come around. She did agree to speak with me and to participate in the book. And I'm glad she did. It's a better book for it. But yeah, you know, she isn't someone who was, you know, checking in or how's that book about me going, anything like that. She sort of had to be talked into it.
Do you think she read it?
I don't think so. I know she was following the reviews. She was happy when it got good reviews, but I would be surprised if she actually sat down and read it. She's a big reader, but she also has a lot on her plate.
Fair. So I want to ask you another question about that, because she so often is the punching bag. Can you tell the story about Congressman Jack Murtha and the Iraq War? Because this blew my mind, and I just didn't know. I remember this happening, and I had no idea of the backstory.
Yeah, it kind of blew my mind too. But yeah, people may remember that back in 2005, you know, well, let's go back to the beginning of the war in Iraq, actually, because I think this is also another really important episode in Nancy Pelosi's career. So in 2002, when the Bush administration was seeking congressional authorization to potentially wage war in Iraq, a lot of Democrats were for it, in part because they viewed it as bad politics to be against it, right? In the post 9/11 era, there was a very sort of very strong patriotic sentiment in the nation, and Democrats feared they would be seen as weak or soft or even unpatriotic if they didn't support the president and support what he was doing in the Middle East, even if a lot of them had questions about it. Nancy Pelosi at the time was the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. And so she had seen some of the classified material on which the Bush administration was basing its case for war, and she didn't think it was good enough, and she didn't agree with the war authorization. So you know, this is at a time when Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, the Democrats leader in the House, Dick Gephardt, they were all supportive of Bush and of his desire to go to war in Iraq. She's in leadership at this time, but she's not the leader of the Democrats in the House. She was the whip. She actually whipped her own party against her own leadership and got about 60% of the House Democrats to vote against the war authorization. Of course, it passed anyway, and we all know the rest. But you know, I think in hindsight, many of those Democrats who viewed her as politically problematic, again, as a liability, making the Democrats look too liberal, that, you know, they look back and would say that she was right. And so that is the backdrop for the war starts to go badly. And the public starts turning against it. The Democrats are trying very hard, particularly the sort of left wing of the party, trying very hard to find ways to force Bush to wind down the war. And one of Nancy Pelosi's close friends and mentors in Congress was Jack Murtha, Democrat from Pennsylvania, famously sort of gruff and I think hawkish, he was the head of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, so famously also a bit corrupt and kind of a chauvinist, a sort of crusty, conservative old Democrat. And she had befriended him. And he became a sort of key validator for her, someone who could go to those other sort of crusty old white men and say, this lady who is one of our colleagues in Congress, you've got to take her seriously. Don't just look at her as, you know, a bimbo or someone you can dismiss. She's got a brain and she really knows what she's doing. So without sort of validators like that from unexpected parts of the conference, she would not have been able to get the support to be in leadership. So so when Murtha came to her and said, you know, as much as, you know, he had supported the war and was generally supportive of the military, he didn't like, he was going to call for withdrawal. And she knew that her fingerprints could not be on this. She knew that if people saw her as being involved in any way, they would blame it on her. They would say, oh, you know, Murtha is just the pawn of the liberal Democrats and Nancy Pelosi, and we shouldn't listen to him. So she said, I want you to go out there alone. And she did not let the other liberals in the Out of Iraq caucus go up there with him. She even, when reporters asked her at her press conference the next day if she supported it, she just said, oh, I don't know anything about it. It's Congressman Murtha's deal and I have no comment on it. They tried repeatedly to get her to say whether she supported it, and she distanced herself from it in every way. And it was not until years later that she finally admitted that she had been sort of helping Murtha orchestrate that strategy from the beginning. But she knew that she knew that it had to be viewed as his initiative alone to have the credibility that it deserved, to have his credibility as a sort of hawkish conservative Democrat. And it was a landmark. It was a big turning point in public perception of the war to have Jack Murtha turn against it and call for withdrawal.
Yeah, yeah. And she got pretty beat up for that too. And
that's the other important point I think I should make is that, you know, this whole time the left wing of the Democratic Party is giving her all kinds of crap for not supporting Jack Murtha and telling her she's a sellout, and, you know, she had Code Pink camped out on her lawn at her house in San Francisco for weeks. Protests. Cindy Sheehan moved to San Francisco, the anti-war activist, just to run against her in the Democratic primary for Congress. And for not impeaching George W. Bush over the war. So the left was very, very mad at her. But not once did she say, you guys, I'm the one doing all this. She just sat on her hands and took
fascinating. I mean, that's something. Oh, okay. So we have to talk about Donald Trump and the sort of adversary that he became for her, which seems like he almost ended up helping her in some of these ways because he was such a perfect foil. Talk about that and about how she sort of used her political mind to combat him.
Yeah, I know. I think Donald Trump was absolutely good for Nancy Pelosi. He sort of gave her, as you say, this foil late in her career that sort of threw a spotlight onto her strengths in contrast to everything that he sort of embodied. You couldn't get two more sort of opposite figures, I think. I don't know, maybe I'll talk about this meeting since it's sort of a good way into it.
Yes, so, the coat, yeah.
Yeah, so you may remember this picture, but you may not remember what exactly it's from. It was December 2018, and the Democrats had just won the midterms, but they had yet to close the deal on a spending agreement with the Republicans that would prevent the government from being shut down. And President Trump at the time wanted money for the border wall, and the Democrats didn't want to give it to him. So the White House calls the Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, invites him to the White House. Schumer, who's quite close to Pelosi, correctly senses that this is an attempt to divide and conquer the Democrats. So he invites Pelosi along. He refused to go alone. But they expect that what they're going to at the White House is a private, behind closed doors negotiating session, the kind of thing you would do with a normal president, a normal White House. But this was one of the things that you may recall Trump liked to do to sort of set his adversaries off balance. He'd keep the cameras in the room. So seemingly on a whim, he told the press who'd come in to just take the photo op of the leaders together. He said, why don't you stay and film this meeting? So they have this meeting negotiating over the border wall, and the Democrats are telling Trump that they're not going to give him his money. And at some point, at the same time, Nancy Pelosi is fighting to get the speakership back, right? Because she has to get the votes of virtually all of the Democrats in her caucus to regain the gavel once that vote is held at swearing in January. So Trump sort of makes mention of this, alludes to it, says, well, I know Nancy can't really talk right now. She's in this tough spot with her own people. And she stops him. She interrupts him, puts out her hand and says, Mr. President, please don't characterize the strength that I bring to this meeting as the leader of the House Democrats who just won a big victory. And so that was the moment where I think you first saw Twitter start to sort of light up, right? Because everybody's watching this live, at least political junkies are. And there were so many Democrats, I think particularly liberal women, the same liberal women who had been the engine of that midterm victory, who were so hungry for any kind of confrontation with Trump, but particularly to see a woman stand up to Trump to his face and interrupt him and refuse to be put in her place and refuse to let him tell her where she stood. So I think on number one, for every woman who was not a big fan of Donald Trump, that was tremendously gratifying, but also for every woman who has ever been talked over by a male colleague in a meeting or had a male boss tell them what to think and felt like they couldn't speak up for themselves. I think it was tremendously powerful and gratifying for all of those people. And then so the meeting ends. Trump takes credit for the shutdown. He says, I'm happy to shut down the government. So the Democrats are, of course, thrilled that he's just said that this whole thing is his fault. They walk out of the White House, and it's a sunny day in December. And Nancy Pelosi puts on her red coat and her tortoiseshell sunglasses, and she has this satisfied little smile on her face. And a meme was born. And so you immediately saw this picture all over Twitter. People are photoshopping, piles of rubble or mushroom clouds into the background, doing animations, putting music on it. And so this was the moment that I think you really saw that reversal in her public image, as people realized, like, as much as she's been sort of caricatured and seen as this sort of rigid, unlikable fossil, that actually she did have some strengths to bring to the table. And that actually, if you are in a face-off with Donald Trump, she's probably the one you want in your corner, because she will never back down and she will never let anyone sort of put her in her place. So it was those qualities of toughness, steeliness, and strategic cleverness that I think made her the right leader for the Democrats in that moment. Because what happened after that was, not only did she get elected speaker again, not only did the government shut down exactly as predicted for 35 days, the longest shutdown in history, but I don't know if people remember this, but during that shutdown, while the Democrats were, Nancy Pelosi doing her thing, keeping the Democrats unified behind the strategy of refusing to really negotiate with the White House when it came to the border wall. And Trump was supposed to give the State of the Union. But not many people realize that the State of the Union is given after the Speaker of the House invites the president to the chamber. So Nancy Pelosi, with her long institutional experience, realized that she didn't have to invite him and could in fact disinvite him. So she disinvited him from giving the State of the Union while the government was shut down, with some excuse about, with the security situation, we can't do it if the government's, shut down. But it's that kind of thing that I think speaks to her institutional experience and sort of creativity, knowing that these procedural levers are there and being able to push them, when someone who hadn't already spent 30 years in Congress might not have known that they could do that, might not have realized that this was one tool at their disposal to sort of send a message to the president. So over and over throughout the Trump administration, she was able to find these little procedural ways to get her way or to achieve her ends, to get the results that she sought against the Trump administration, despite the relative weakness of her position as the only the only non-Republican leader of a branch of government.
Yeah, that's so, yeah, I forgot about that. You were right. Okay, so I'm gonna ask one more kind of general question, and then I have some audience questions to ask you before we wrap it up. But so I want to touch then to end with on this big theme, right? Like throughout the book, you describe Pelosi as like essentially someone from another time of politics, like when Donald Trump would not be the president, would not be the center of the Republican Party, less about showmanship, all this kind of personality driven Twitter politics that we see today. Like she's from another era and is very much about, as we say, like the function of things and making it happen. Do you see that as like a lesson in politics today? Are you holding this up as an example?
That's a great question. I don't like the idea of her being an anachronism because I don't think it should be a relic of an earlier era to know how to do your job of governing. And I try to make the case in the book that regardless of your political sympathies, and I personally do not have a side politically. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. But regardless of what side you come down on, you should want a government that works, and you should want a government that is occupied by people who know how to do the job. And I think regardless of your political positions, you have to admit that Nancy Pelosi is good at her job of running the House of Representatives in an era when no one else seems to know how to do it. Right? Between her first and second speakership, we had two Republican speakers, John Boehner and Paul Ryan, both of whom just couldn't get the job done. There were repeated shutdowns on their watch. The House was completely paralyzed. They couldn't keep their own caucus together enough to pass legislation, even though they had the majority of votes in the House. And certainly could not, work with the Senate to get major legislation passed, couldn't even repeal Obamacare when they had both the House and Senate. So I don't think it should be an anachronism to know what you're doing. And I think that, the skills that Nancy Pelosi has are somewhat timeless. It's a very difficult and specialized job, right? You have 435 members, 220 some in your own caucus, and you've got to keep them all going in the same direction, and you've got to not just know who they all are, which I struggle with, but Nancy Pelosi could tell you not just all of their names, but what district they're from and what the politics are of that district and what committees they're on and what committees they want to be on and what caucuses they're a member of and who they're feuding with or don't want to be on a committee with and what bills are important to them, what their pet issues are. So all of these things, and she talks about it as being like a weaver at a loom, right? You're bringing all these strings together. And I really think that it's just a skill that you can be good or bad at, to know how to govern. And there's so many excuses have been made for the incompetence of so many politicians, right? That, oh, we're just living in an era of gridlock and polarization, and it's just impossible now because of the way things are structured. But I think Nancy Pelosi proves that that's not true. That if you are good enough at your job, you can still get things done, even in this era of polarization and gridlock. And she's proven that.
Yeah. Okay, so a few audience questions before we wrap things up. Lori asks, can you talk about her apparent endless energy and endurance? Even during the investigation and the hearings on Trump's call to Ukraine, she never appeared tired or impatient when talking to the press. This is a really good question. And you describe sort of her lifestyle in the book, which is just really fascinating too. So go into that a little bit for us.
Yeah, she never seems to eat or sleep. In fact, the book opens with a scene where on the eve of becoming speaker for the second time, she wasn't able to sleep the night before. So she was actually operating on no sleep for that entire, 28-hour day where she's on her feet the whole time. She's always in those 4-inch heels. She doesn't drink alcohol or caffeine except what she gets from chocolate. And so, after I interviewed her for the profile that first time, I went on a campaign swing with her to Houston. And, I am a little more than half her age. I, on that trip, had probably half as many meetings than she did. My shoes are probably half as high, and she completely wore me out. By the time we were done with dinner at the hotel we were staying at in Houston, I just wanted to crawl into bed. I was exhausted. And she's going, well, there's still time to make some phone calls to the East Coast, and maybe I'll stay up and watch the Olympics. And she just seemed as perky as she had at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I was just wiped out. So I asked her, and I'm not the first person to ask her, right? There's so many stories of, her fellow members of Congress going on international trips with her, and she says, make sure you pack your suit and your duffel bag because we're not stopping at the hotel before our first, meeting with the prime minister. And she just has this incredible stamina. And I've asked her about it, and she, with a completely straight face, she just says, well, I'm Italian. We have great stamina. And I think she quite literally just believes that it is, I mean, it is clearly some kind of genetic gift. And she associates it with her Italian heritage, that is the reason she has this incredible level of energy. But, I would make one other point about that, which is, I write a lot in the book about her being a mother and what I think that taught her. And from that first interview that I had with her, she talked about, and I relate to this very much as a mother of 3 myself, that when you have your first child, you're caring for that first newborn, and you think, my God, I will never sleep again. My life is over. But you realize that you're capable of so much more than you thought. There are more hours in the day than you thought. You are capable of, frontiers of sleeplessness and desensitization to poop that you did not know were possible. And you just feel your capacities expand. And I really think that it was that early experience being a mother of 5 and running that household where the kids, all made their own school lunches on an assembly line, where the children set the table for breakfast as soon as they were done with dinner. She ran a very tight ship. And I think, and so I think that experience of being a young mother taught her a lot about the stamina that she was capable of, the level of energy that she was capable of. And to bring it back to my point before about representation, if you think about 200 odd years of American history and the general tendency of men to change diapers in the era of 1776 to 1950, there were not a lot of people in the leadership of this country who ever had that experience of mothering young children, of bringing up babies, of being all alone in a house of 5 screaming toddlers. And so I think that's another way in which what she brings to the table not only gives her some of the skills that she continues to draw upon, but gives her new and different skills from the men who had always occupied those positions in the past.
Yeah, you said 6 kids or 5 kids in 6 years or something like that. That's 5 kids in 6 years is a lot. I'm very impressed by that personally.
I believe it's exactly 6 years and 10 days between the birth of the first and the birth of the 5th child.
That's amazing. Here's a question I like. Does Molly feel that Nancy Pelosi's formality and her privacy are necessary for her success?
That's a very deep observation. And yes, I would agree with it. I do think, one of the other things that I quote her sort of habitually saying is, she says, every morning I put on a suit of armor, eat nails for breakfast, and go out to do battle. So I do think that it is something of a defense mechanism. This sort of closedness, this formality that she has, it is something of a defense mechanism against the world that she's always faced, the world that she faced as one of 23 women in the House of Representatives at a time when all kinds of things were accepted that are not so accepted today or shouldn't be. But when there wasn't even a women's bathroom on the House floor, and women weren't allowed to wear pants on the floor of the Senate. So she has been through a lot of inhospitable times for women. And so I think that, yes, to answer the question, a lot of that guardedness that she has surely comes from a sort of self-protective instinct.
Yeah. That brings me to another question. Is she becoming, do you think, an icon for younger women? And this, I wonder this too, because I wonder, like what you essentially think her legacy will be, or like how she's going to be remembered by the next generation and the generation after that.
Yeah, I don't know. The question about, is she an icon to young? Certainly, I have seen, young women come up to her and ask her to sign their books for them, tell her she's an inspiration, etc. At the same time, you also have a lot of young women who would rather look up to someone like AOC, right? Who would rather look up to this younger generation of more liberal Democrats who are pushing for change and who have created a public profile that is much more open and accessible and personal. And so I think that on the one, I think that, yes, I think that her image has turned around in a way that has made her sort of iconic to a new generation in ways that she wasn't before. I think she is being appreciated, as President Trump might say, being appreciated in new ways. I think he said that about Frederick Douglass, but more and more people are saying that they appreciate Nancy Pelosi. But I get asked a lot about the dynamic between her and AOC because they are somewhat seen as rivals or pitted against each other, sometimes in sort of overtly sexist sort of catfight type of ways. But they have also clearly had their disagreements in the last couple of years. And AOC got to Congress by defeating a member of Democratic leadership, an ally of Nancy Pelosi's in a Democratic primary in New York. So there was sort of a natural tension there. But, the day, it was the summer of 2018 when AOC defeated Joe Crowley in that Democratic primary. And Nancy Pelosi called her friend Joe Crowley and told him how devastated she was that he had lost. But the very next morning, she was on the phone to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying, "I'm always so happy to have young progressive women in my caucus. Let's figure out, what you can do here." And so she has tried to maintain that relationship. She does very much sort of mentor the up and coming generation of women. So it'll be interesting for me to see, I think, particularly as she eventually leaves politics, how she is regarded, particularly by the progressive left, that often see her as, too cautious, too establishment, too much of an incrementalist, too much of a sort of institutionalist. She's never been a revolutionary. She's never been a socialist. She's never been someone who really wanted to smash the establishment, as much as she is regarded, particularly by the right, as this sort of scary, screaming, far left liberal figure. Yeah. So if you have the paperback of the book, I do have a new afterword where I meditate a little on her legacy. And what I say is, I think it is threefold. I think, number one, it's clear what she wants her legacy to be, and that's the Affordable Care Act. When I've asked her about it, when other people ask her about it, the thing that she wants to be remembered for, for 100 years, the Democratic Party tried and failed to enact some form of universal entitlement to health care. And it was with Nancy Pelosi leading the House that they finally did it. And she was a huge part of that process. It probably would not have gotten done without her, even though most of the histories of the process focus far more on the Senate. I make the case that that's because, she's so good at her job that she sort of makes it look easy or gets taken for granted. But it was very difficult, and a lesser speaker probably could not have gotten it done. So that's what she wants her legacy to be, that and other pieces of big legislation that she's shepherded through the House. I think her effectiveness also has to be part of her legacy. I am not a historian or political scientist, but the historians and political scientists tell me that they would rank her with the great legislators of American history. With up there with like an LBJ, a Sam Rayburn, a Tip O'Neill. So her effectiveness, particularly, as I've said, in an age of historic polarization and gridlock, where not a lot of people were able to be effective. And then lastly, being the first woman speaker. That it's one of those accomplishments that's easy to look back and forget what a big deal it was. But she came in at a time when there were only 23 women in the House, and she had to overcome a lot of skepticism, and she was not the next in line for Democratic whip when she first ran for leadership. In fact, she was running against the sort of establishment pick. And when she first set out to run for leadership, the word got back to her sort of through the House Democratic grapevine that what those men in the male-dominated Democratic establishment were saying about her was, well, who said she could run? And this infuriated her. The idea that she needed to ask permission, the idea that somebody had to say that she was allowed to run. She was so, and so her response to that was, well, that just lights my fire. She took it as motivation and to work that much harder to get what she believed she deserved, because she was so angry, and she does have a temper. And she was so angry to hear that someone was saying that about her. There's another thing that they were saying that I don't think this made it into the book, but I love this story, that the word also got back to her, that some of the men in leadership were saying, well, if there are things that the women want, why don't they just give us a list and we'll do it for them? And again, it incensed her, the idea that the women didn't need to be represented. Women didn't need to themselves be in leadership because they could just tell the men what they wanted and the men would do it.
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze in one more here. This is from Susan, and I think ends it well. What do you think Speaker Pelosi will do next in 2022 or beyond?
Well, this is a very taboo subject. Nobody wants to raise it in Nancy Pelosi's presence because it's quite sort of touchy. When she was negotiating with the House Democrats in 2018 to regain the speakership, one of the concessions that she made to get the moderates on board was to agree to a term limit that would say basically that she could serve no more than 2 additional terms as speaker. And this term limit supposedly also applies to the other 2 Democratic leaders, Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn, who have been in those positions together with Nancy Pelosi for 18, I believe, years now. So, a lot of the Democratic angst doesn't have anything to do with ageism or sexism necessarily. It's just the fact that there's no upward mobility in the Democratic caucus, and there hasn't been for nearly 2 decades, simply because these 3 leaders cling to power. Mm-hmm. So she did accept a term limit that would force her to stop being speaker in 2022. She has indicated that she plans to abide by that. However, she is still running for re-election, and she hasn't made any sort of overt plans for her departure. It's going to be a huge transition for the Democratic caucus, particularly if all 3 leaders leave at once. It's going to be a generational change, the kind of thing that usually happens one by one, and just all at once it's going to be a new slate of leaders. So I think there's a lot of sort of very quiet jockeying among the House Democratic caucus now, because nobody wants her to find out that they're angling to replace her, but everyone is angling to replace her. She doesn't want to lame duck herself by being really open about her plans to move on. And I'm sure that if she feels called to stay on for whatever reason, she could find a way to do it. She could find a way to get the rules adjusted and get the votes she needed. And everyone kind of knows that. So it's a bit of an open question still, but she has indicated that she will likely move on in 2022.
We shall see. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Molly. Thanks to everyone for coming. This was so fun and super interesting. And I can't thank you enough for doing it.
Thanks,
Lauren,
everyone,
thank you for hosting. Molly, where can we get your book, Pelosi? Where's the best place to get it?
Anywhere books are sold. I would say if you go to bookshop.org, you can order from an independent bookstore if you prefer that to Amazon. It is also available on Amazon and every other type of website where you can order books, and hopefully at your local library as well.
Well, Molly Ball, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and thank you for enlightening us on a very controversial character in Congress. So thank you so much. And Lauren Gilger, thank you for hosting us this evening. Lauren, you can hear Lauren on the show weekdays on KJZZ. And we have recorded tonight's interview. And so you'll be able to see it on our book club page on kjzz.org. If you want to share it with your friends, please do. And Molly, next time you're in Phoenix, be sure and stop by the station. Thanks everyone for coming. Be sure and become a sustaining member of KJZZ and support your local public radio. Thank you and good night.